Hi, and welcome to Axelbank Reports History and Today, conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter right now. I'm Evan Axelbank, and today we're going to speak with Ed Achorn, the author of The Lincoln Miracle, Inside the Republican Convention That Changed History. He's written 4 books and is the former editorial page editor for the Providence Journal. He was also the 56th and 31st guest on our show. Ed, it's great to have you back.
Oh, it's great to be back, Evan.
Before we start our interview, I want to invite listeners to our Patreon page to ask for your support in keeping the show going. Go to patreon.com/AxelbankHistory. We will donate part of your contributions to a charity for children's literacy. At one time, political conventions meant more than balloons and a chance for a candidate to speak to the nation on primetime TV. They weren't just the official anointing of a candidate that we're familiar with today who went through a primary calendar and amassed the most delegates. There was actual drama. Party elders, ordinary American citizens, didn't know who was going to win before they started. In 1860, an underdog lawyer from Springfield, Illinois, had designs on shocking American politics by outmaneuvering better known and better qualified hopefuls for the nomination of the new party called the Republican Party. That Abraham Lincoln was able to do so wound up changing world history. So, Ed Achorn, what does our democracy lose by not having drama at our political conventions?
Well, there's always a question whether the voters should be involved in the primary setup as we have now, or whether party elders should meet in the back room in smoke-filled rooms. And that's what produced Lincoln. These party elders who were not interested in who would be the best president to lead the country in an upcoming crisis, which obviously was heading towards the country in 1860. Their decision was based on who would collect the most votes for Republicans around the country. And the fact they chose this guy who was uniquely suited to lead us through that terrible war, the Civil War, is really a miracle. It's an incredible thing.
Abraham Lincoln is well known today for having an insatiable ambition. Of course, we have the hindsight of 2020, right? The 2020 hindsight, which makes that, I guess, an easy story to tell from the vantage point of 150 years later. But William Herndon recognized that right away. His law partner described it like this: the man who thinks Lincoln quietly sat down and gathered his robes about him, waiting for the people to call on him, has a very erroneous knowledge of Lincoln. He was always calculating and planning ahead. His ambition was a little engine that knew no rest. What was it about Lincoln that made him perfect to enter a convention as the seeming underdog?
Well, Lincoln was a brilliant strategist. Now, he entered this as you mentioned, as a terrible underdog. He had not held office in more than 10 years. He had lost 2 runs for the U.S. Senate. People were talking about him at best as a possible VP candidate because he came from an important swing state. But he had very carefully strategized this convention ahead of time. He sent people there he knew would fight hard for him. The candidates in those days didn't go to the conventions themselves. They had to have people fighting for them. And he came up with a strategy where he would emerge as the second best choice of everybody. If they couldn't get their first love nominated, as Lincoln put it, they could turn to us. And he urged his people not to offend any of the other candidates or the delegations, and to just make the case, look, Lincoln's the most electable. And that's what they did.
What was happening in America that started to create the conditions where Abraham Lincoln suddenly seemed more appealing?
Well, as I think I mentioned, William Seward was the superstar of the Republican Party. He was a former governor of New York. He was a prominent U.S. senator. He had essentially built up the Republican Party to the point it was a serious party ready to take on the Democrats. And everybody thought this would be his convention. And he went in there with the most delegates. He had this political boss backing him, Thurlow Weed from New York, who had a record of making or breaking presidential candidates and Senate candidates. He had all the money. He brought in huge numbers of people to Chicago, something like thousands of supporters. And so it was supposed to be Seward's convention. And it opened on Seward's birthday. I mean, the whole thing was set up to be this incredible event for Seward. But some of the things operating in the background against that were several months before the convention, this radical abolitionist named John Brown had gone to Harper's Ferry and raided a federal armory and was planning to arm slaves for a violent uprising, insurgency against whites. And he was caught and hanged, but this panicked the South, and it panicked much of the North, who thought all this debate about slavery is creating an impossible strain on our political system. And if we don't watch it, it could lead to secession and a civil war. So these very practical politicians who gathered in Chicago for the Republican convention were thinking, who can we nominate who will not turn off swing voters? Seward was a man who was associated with the really liberal arguments against slavery. He was the most outspoken opponent of slavery in the country. He was very pro-immigrant, and that turned off a lot of the Republican base who thought immigrants were being used by Democrats to steal elections. So all these things were sort of weighing on these delegates. If we nominate Seward, there's a real danger he'll turn off swing voters. Now, Lincoln had said some same thing. It had been just as strong, I believe, in speaking out against slavery as Seward, but he was less well known, so he wasn't as risky as Seward. And he was very pro-immigrant, but people didn't really know that about him, unlike Seward, who had made a big point of embracing immigrants and befriending the bishop of the Catholic Church in New York.
It's fascinating to me that Lincoln cultivated his relationship with his German constituents by running a German language newspaper. He understood politics. What was in his background, and how did he develop as a politician to begin to understand the way it was played at a high level, even though he never became a U.S. senator or was a candidate for president before 1860?
Well, he approached politics from the very retail level. He spent 6 months a year on this judicial circuit in Illinois. They went from town to town in these log cabins that were courthouses and dispensing justice. And he would meet all sorts of people, and they came to respect him because he was a great storyteller. He was an honorable man. He was obviously very intelligent. And through this experience, he really cultivated an understanding of the people, and they cultivated an understanding of him. Now, what happened with the German Americans was the chief moderate alternative to Seward going into this convention was this guy named Edward Bates, who was a judge from Missouri. And he was supported by very prominent people, including Horace Greeley, who was the most influential editor in the country. I mean, he was phenomenally important. And what he said, the delegates listened very closely to. So he went to the convention, and he was arguing for Edward Bates. He said, Seward's too controversial. He's too liberal. We got to go with Bates. But what brought Bates down was that German Americans got involved. They were just a small part of the Republican Party, but they were enough to swing elections in several northern states. And what they did was have their own convention that week in Chicago, right down the road from the Republican convention. And basically, they sent out the message, if you nominate Bates, we're going to bolt.
Mm.
So all this stuff played right into Lincoln's hands. They weren't against Lincoln. They supported Seward, but they couldn't go with Bates. So this is an amazing thing, a confluence of events that really permitted Lincoln to emerge as an alternative to Seward.
I don't want to put you on the spot here because I know you're not necessarily a political historian, but what do we need to know about the history of conventions to that point?
Well, the parties had emerged, and they discovered into the 1840s that the best way to select a nominee and get everybody behind him was to have these conventions where they could hash out their disagreements and settle on a candidate and rally around them. So that's why these conventions emerged the way they did. And this one in Chicago was just incredible.
Well,
Seward, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to ask before we get to some of the nitty gritty of the wigwam and the hotel that some of this stuff was run out of. I do want to ask, just set up the Republican Party for us. What was it to that point? It was really in its infancy.
Yes.
It was sort of a descendant from the Whig Party. What was it wasn't the GOP yet, it was the GNP, right? The Grand New Party. What was the Republican Party and how did it form?
It was really a mishmash. It was made up of basically a lot of people who couldn't stand the Democrats and wanted an alternative to the Democrats. So it spanned a tremendous group. It included people who were anti-slavery, particularly against the spread of slavery to the Western territories before they were states. And that was really the crux, the base of the Republican Party. They wanted to prevent the spread of slavery, stop it where it was. But there were also other people in the party. As I mentioned, anti-immigrant groups. There were people who wanted the Homestead Act so they could get houses on government land in the West. There were people who wanted a transcontinental railroad. There were people who wanted tariffs placed on imports, so northern manufacturing could get a chance to get started. So there were all these different groups, and some of them even came to the convention. Like two major states, New Jersey and Pennsylvania, came to the convention without even calling themselves Republicans. They were just anti-Democrats, their delegations. And
we have too much of that in politics these days right now, right?
That's what it was. And so that made it very dicey to try to pull all these people together behind one candidate.
When it comes to your book, and your book is wonderful because there are so many wonderful scenes in it that really make the city of Chicago come alive. And that is a major personality of this book, is this wonderful, beautiful city, which if you've never been, you should go. Not you, I know you've been there, but anybody listening should go. It's just a wonderful place. And it really is a place where you just treasure every minute to take in the atmosphere of this great city. If I was there in 1860, at the beginning of this convention in May of 1860, what was this city like? And what would I have felt like being in that grimy town that it was back then?
Well, the one thing it had in common with modern Chicago was it was a great engine for making money. I mean, that's what it was all about. And in 1860, it had 112,000 people, was the ninth largest city in the country. And it was booming like no other city. It had more rail lines connecting to it than any city on the globe at that point, which is amazing because only 30 years earlier, it had been essentially a few cabins on swampy land around the Chicago River. And all of a sudden, it was this booming city. And it grew so fast that it had enormous problems with health and everything else. The streets were all dusty or muddy. they had to lift all the buildings downtown about 12 feet
I
because
couldn't
they
believe
had,
that fact in your
yes,
book. That was
yes,
amazing. Yeah.
they had to lift the buildings in order to raise enough ground, raise the ground level so they could put in sewer pipes because people were dying of horrible diseases from the sewage, and it was overrun with rats. So this is the city the delegates came to.
And there were a fair amount of bars and parties going on. Brothels are a theme in your
Brothels.
book.
Oh yes.
What was the underworld of Chicago like, and did that play a role in the politics of the city?
Well, it had already developed a naughty reputation. So the mayor of the city was raiding the brothels and picked up a bunch of delegates, as a matter of fact. And the newspapers were saying he did this on purpose because they would like pay him off and get off the charges. So this was going on in the background as well.
What were the sources you used for this book? I always love to ask that question. How did you piece this story back together?
Well, yeah, what I do is, my editor calls it micro history, but I try to look at a very short period of time, and and in this case it's a week in Chicago, and I try to go back and gather every voice I can find from that week. I mean, letters written to Lincoln from his friends that week that are in the Lincoln papers at the Library of Congress, newspaper accounts, memoirs, just everything I could gather about this one week. And it's so fun because it gives you a real sense of what's going on and the voices of the people of the time, which I find fascinating.
So describe, if you can, I guess you can call it a building. I'm not sure what it is. Describe, if you can, the convention hall, the wigwam, and then also the very important hotel where many of the delegates stayed and many of Lincoln's strategists stayed.
Yes,
David Davis, suite number 74. I wrote that down.
yes. Well, David Davis arrived in Chicago. He was the judge. I mentioned the circuit that Lincoln traveled the circuit 6 months a year. Well, Davis was the judge on that, and he was sort of as close to Lincoln as anybody. And so he knew Lincoln and respected him. And he came to Chicago, and he discovered, to his horror, that nobody in the campaign had thought of booking a headquarters for the campaign, and they would have been dead in the water without that. So Davis immediately took charge. He bribed some other hotel people at the Tremont House Hotel, which was the major political hotel in the city. He bribed them to leave, and he moved in and set up the Lincoln headquarters. And he made himself the manager of the Lincoln effort at that point. Nobody appointed him. He just did it because that's the kind of person he was. And
the wigwam. Tell me about the wigwam. There should be an arena, a basketball arena named the Wigwam or something.
Isn't that great? Yeah, the Wigwam was, they were going to try to use another building in Chicago, but nothing really said, this is the modern booming Chicago. So they built this thing in like 6 weeks. It was just made of unfinished wood. It was a very basic building, but you could stuff 11,000 people in there. And the ladies of Chicago came and decorated it with bunting and with evergreens. So you can imagine, with these gas lights flaring in this wooden building, as Bruce Catton, one of my favorite historians, wrote, it must have been the biggest fire trap ever built in America. And it was, and people just packed themselves into this building during the convention. It was extraordinary. They had a ladies' gallery, which looked down on the stage, the giant stage that the delegates were on. And essentially, to get in there, you needed to have a lady on your arm. So these men began hiring women out on the street so they could get into the convention hall, and they hired prostitutes and schoolgirls and everything they could find to get in this building. And that's part of the story.
Tell me about the politics before Lincoln was elected, and even before he was the Republican nominee. Where was America at this point? I mean, it's easy to look at Lincoln's election and then the rupture that happened after. But was there enough foresight to realize that nominating Lincoln and having him elected president could break the country in half?
Well, that was always in the background. It had become so divisive in the country over slavery. And people in the North were getting really fed up with the Democratic Party. It was they associated it with corruption. They associated it with giving in to everything the South wanted in terms of slavery, and they were infuriated by things like a South Carolina congressman went into the Senate chamber one day and clubbed a Massachusetts senator nearly to death, Charles Sumner, nearly to death, because he was angry about his speech against slavery. And the North and people in the North were basically fed up with the Democrats. Now, the Democrats were madly trying to figure out a way to link the Northern and Southern Democrats, and they just couldn't do it. So they had a convention several days before the Republican one, and they were unable to choose a nominee, and they split into Northern and Southern factions and just adjourned without selecting a nominee. So the Republicans entered this convention with a damn good thinking they had a damn good chance to elect the next president of the United States.
What did the other candidates in this race think of Lincoln when they looked at this guy coming? He may have had a bit of a home field advantage because he only had to travel up the road from Springfield, but you have very big names in American politics here, Seward being one of them. How did they perceive any potential challenge from this guy who was known, but certainly not a big player in national politics?
Baking from our childhoods just sticks in the memory, doesn't it? We never set off on holiday without piles of Tupperware, and there'd always be Bakewell slice, flapjacks, and tray baked scones in the boot.
Do you not do that, Lisa?
Yeah, no. Sadly, I do not stack the Tupperware in the back of the car when we go off on holiday.
Oh.
Welcome to Small Ways to Live Well, a new podcast from the Simple Things magazine. Season 2 is a pick-me-up tonic that helps us make the shift from winter to spring. A 6-week suggestion box full of things to note, notice and enjoy about the season. Search for Small Ways to Live Well on your podcast app.
Yeah, as I said, he was considered a complete underdog, really. I mean, this was supposed to be Seward's convention.
Yes, the 69 Mets, if I may say, right?
Well, yeah, or the 67 Red Sox.
There you go, right. That's you, right.
But I start off describing Harper's Magazine on the day the book begins, May 12th, 1860, and they've got this center spread of the candidates, and they've got this giant oval of Seward in the middle, and then they've got Lincoln down on the bottom with the also-rans. So that's basically how the party viewed Lincoln at that point. And the longest write-up in the Harper's Weekly was for Seward, and then Lincoln was at the end, this little tiny bit at the end. So he was really an underdog, and they, obviously he came in there. He had not held office for more than a decade. He ran a 2-man law office. That was essentially his executive experience. Now, up against that, he's running against people like Chase, who had been governor of Ohio, and Seward, who had been governor of New York, which was the most populous and powerful state in the country at the time. And even Bates had a little more experience. So Lincoln entered as a very, very long shot, and they chose Chicago. Ironically, the Republican National Committee chose Chicago mainly because they thought there was no serious candidate from Illinois in the race. So it'd be like nobody would have home field advantage, and of course, it gave Lincoln tremendous home field advantage.
Yeah. What was his initial strategy? What was Lincoln's initial strategy coming into this thing? We're familiar, I guess. We just saw a number of ballots go through for or be cast for the most recent election for Speaker of the House. So we've seen some situations where there were many ballots cast, and some of the vote totals change as we go from vote to vote. What was his strategy, and how did that strategy relate around there would be, he hoped, more than one batch of ballots cast?
Yes, his strategy was a brilliant one, I think. He for one thing, he didn't tell anyone he was running for president for a long time. He didn't want to stick his neck out and have people say, well, this guy has no experience. What's he running for president for? And what he told his team to do was go there and make the case we're a good second choice. If you can't get what Lincoln called your first love, you can turn to us. And they very carefully made that case. They didn't offend any other delegations. They didn't put down any of their opponents. They just said, hey, if you can't get your candidate, turn to Lincoln. Lincoln can win. And they made the case why he could win. And so that was proved a very effective strategy for them. And part of it was his life story, having been born in a log cabin, this poor guy, and he worked with his hands. He was already known as the rail splitter, thanks to a state convention a week earlier, where they came up with that brilliant PR stunt of associating him with rail splitting. And this really appealed to voters who thought, well, here this guy worked with his hands. He's like one of us. He won't be like these elites in Washington who are ripping us off. And that was a very powerful message for them to transmit.
As it often goes for front runners, James Seward included, things start to go in ways they hadn't expected. And what was so amazing, that I wrote down some notes on this, it was so amazing to me that putting the convention in Chicago wound up playing into the hands of Abraham Lincoln. And it winds up being that Seward's home state of New York starts to work in ways that Seward had not expected. Explain that for us.
Well, the things that really helped Lincoln was, and the national press or the party didn't really understand this, the kind of loyalty he had in Illinois. They loved this guy, and they flocked up to Chicago to help him. Seward had trouble because Horace Greeley, who was this famous newspaper editor, who had long been associated with Seward and his campaign manager, Thurlow Weed, he went to Chicago and he worked against Seward all week. And, this is somebody who the people all over the country listened to. So the delegates listened closely to him when he said, look, Seward can't win. And this was a very powerful thing. Now, the Seward people thought, and probably rightly, that this was all because Seward and Weed had blocked Greeley's rise in politics. This guy was a newspaper editor, but he basically wanted direct power. So he wanted to be lieutenant governor of New York. And they blocked his rise. They gave it to the editor of the New York Times instead. So he obviously had a reason to be resentful of Seward, and he certainly did a number on him in Chicago.
I don't want to give too much of the book away, but if you can, just explain where Lincoln is kind of watching from. And there's a point where his guy, David Davis, basically says, you can't bother me right now. Like, if you want me to work for you, I can't be bothered with your telegrams or your telegraph stuff anymore. So please leave me alone. I'm working, but I'll get back to you. So Lincoln's watching from a distance, and this guy is basically pulling strings as the votes get cast and cast and cast.
Yeah, I'll give away a little of the book, but Seward was all primed to win the nomination. This was the second day of the convention. He had won all these test votes, and so he was really in a good position. And they were ready to start nominating the president. And if they had done that, Seward would have been nominated. Nobody had been established yet as the chief alternative to Seward. So at the podium, they announced, well, we don't have the tally sheets ready yet. So it'll be about 5 minutes before we get those up here. And the delegates by that time were tired and hungry, and they said, well, it's going to be Seward anyway. So they adjourned and decided to come back the next day, Friday morning, to vote for the nomination.
You know, it strikes me if there's two rules in politics. One is if you don't have the vote, don't take the vote. But if you have the votes,
Oh, yes.
take the vote.
Well, they couldn't stop the delegates from
Being hungry.
So immediately Lincoln's men leapt into action all night and made certain deals. And they got a message that night from Lincoln, which was effectively, make no deals in my name. And they were really distressed about this. And they some of them cursed Lincoln. Some of them said, what's he doing? Doesn't he understand what we're up against? And David Davis, who was this classic David Davis, he just looked at the message and said, Lincoln ain't here. And he said, whatever we have to do, he's going to have to ratify. So we'll just act as if we didn't get this message. And that's what they did. They made deals with primarily Indiana and Pennsylvania that night. And that made all the difference.
What I couldn't believe is that the Lincoln tactic that became famous in the movie Lincoln of trading jobs and patronage for votes was put to use during this convention. I mean, they were literally playing old school politics with a guy who didn't even have power yet. I mean, that's how good at this Lincoln's men were.
It's great stuff. I love this stuff. Yeah, they were. In fact, David Davis later confessed that he had promised the same jobs to multiple delegations. And somebody said, well, oh, so you prevaricated? And he said, prevaricated? We lied like hell. So this is David Davis.
What I think is wonderful is that ended up being the way that they would pass an anti-slavery amendment in the United States. It's truly an incredible political story, and I guess a leopard doesn't change their spots.
Well, this is, one of the things, this has been a debate over the years of whether Lincoln's people really traded jobs for power. And, I think all the historical evidence is lined up that of course they did. And this is how politics works. I mean, let's be honest. And but for many years, people, Lincoln was too far above that. His people wouldn't have engaged in that. But it's very clear they did.
Yeah. How did the rest of the convention play out? I don't know how much you want to give away, but when does this miracle, and how does this miracle, as you put it, start to take shape?
Well, I don't mind giving some of this away, but Lincoln's people even did things like printing up counterfeit tickets and signing them, forging the names of Republican leaders overnight before that decisive Friday morning vote. So what happened was the Seward people were probably partying all night, drinking champagne. They got up and decided to have one of their grand marches to the wigwam. And so they all got up and they had marching bands and they were just, this is great. We're going to march to the wigwam and nominate Lincoln. And nominate Seward. And when they got there, their seats had been taken by Lincoln supporters with their forged tickets. So they couldn't get in, even though they had legit tickets.
You want to play politics, you got to play to win, I guess, right?
So effectively that morning, the Lincoln people were as loud or louder than all these thousands of Seward supporters that Weed had brought to Chicago. So it was an incredible psychological advantage to have so many people in the wigwam. And as the voting went along, Davis did not know if these deals he made would hold, especially with Pennsylvania. But as they started to swing behind Lincoln, the whole place was astonished. And because they went in that morning expecting Seward would win the nomination.
He becomes the Republican nominee. Describe the moment, if you can, when he finds out that is the case.
Yeah, people. He's in Springfield, and he's all nervous. He was playing handball that morning to expend some energy, um, and so he went to his office, and he was too nervous even to stay there. So he went to the newspaper office and the Telegraph was nearby, and he found out after the first ballot, Lincoln was such a shrewd political. Now Seward was way ahead on the first ballot, but Lincoln was such a shrewd political analyst. He said he's not going to make it. He doesn't have enough delegates. And they swung around behind Lincoln, and Lincoln won on the third ballot. And it was extraordinary. And the message came through to Springfield, and Lincoln took it very calmly. He people could tell he was kind of nervous, but he didn't jump up and say, hey, or anything like that. He just said that there's a little woman who wants to hear this news, and that was, of course, Mary Lincoln. And he walked home and told her, and the whole city went crazy.
Then he gets elected president, and the country and then the world changed forever, in particular for those who gave their lives in the Civil War, and then those who were freed, partly on their own doing and partly on the political maneuvering of Abraham Lincoln. Where do you rank the election of Abraham Lincoln to the presidency in terms of the long stream of American politics?
Well, I think this was obviously a tremendous turning point for the country, and it was an absolute miracle that Lincoln was nominated. I mean, if they had taken that vote Thursday night, he wouldn't have been. And I think if they had nominated anyone but Lincoln, this country would be divided right now. I don't think it would have survived. And the delegates didn't understand this, but the person they nominated had a set of skills that were uniquely suited to surviving that war. I mean, he had powers of endurance. He had the ability with the English language to move the public. He was a really shrewd political tactician, and the delegates didn't really understand that at the time. And some of the people covering this as journalists, I write about this in the book, thought that there was a divine aspect of this. The Almighty worked on that convention to get this guy in office at this moment.
What does it say?
And it is quite extraordinary.
What does it say that folks who were expecting to be the nominees and were his political opponents wind up serving in the administration? What does it say about Lincoln's own political ability, and what does it say about the strength of the administration that would then go ahead and last 5 years through the most difficult period in American history?
Yeah, one of the things that strikes me is Lincoln's tremendous confidence. I mean, despite it, and I had mentioned he just ran a two-man law office, but he put together a cabinet, and he understood he had to do this, that represented the whole breadth of the Republican Party and all these factions that were at each other's throats. Seward, he made Seward a Secretary of State, which was the most important cabinet position. But Seward tried to manipulate Lincoln into appointing his supporters to the cabinet, so it would sort of be a pseudo Seward presidency, and Lincoln refused to do that. And Seward was threatening to bolt, which would have been a disaster for Lincoln. Lincoln held firm. He put rivals on that cabinet famously, and they were rivals not only of each other but of him. I mean, it was incredible what he did, and he had to do it because the Republican Party was so segmented. He was a minority president. He won. And I just noted this the other day. He won the presidency with a smaller percentage of the popular vote than any president in our history, which is extraordinary. His strength
that held the administration,
and he had to bring the whole party together to have any hope of it not splintering, and that would have been a total disaster.
All right. So most of the authors who I interview do things in order. One book flows obviously from one part of history to the next part of history. You have flowed backwards. You started with Abraham Lincoln. When you started writing about Lincoln, you started with the second inaugural book, which, by the way, everybody, is just a fabulous book. I've read many dozens of books, maybe 3 or 4 dozen books on Lincoln, and it's really one of the best. Ed Achorn's book, Every Drop of Blood, which covers the second inaugural. How did it wind up that you went backwards in time, going first from the second inaugural to Lincoln's nomination?
I wrote 2 baseball books, books on 19th century baseball, and then I finally had the nerve to write about Abraham Lincoln, who was somebody I had read about my whole life and admired. And I decided to go with that speech just because it's such a moving and extraordinary thing for a president to make that speech at that point in the war. And you kind of got to read the book to know what I mean. But it was, and that speech had always moved me and struck me as so strange and inspiring. So I wanted to do that book. But oddly enough, when I wrote my first baseball book, I had a dream one night of a book that I had written called The Wigwam, and I can still see the cover in my dream. And I thought, well, gee, that would make a good book sometime. So all these years later, 13 years later, I'm out with the Lincoln Miracle, which is about the Wigwam and that convention.
That's awesome. What moment do you wish there was video of from the convention? What would you like to see with your own eyes?
Oh boy, I'd love to see Davis manipulating the delegates.
Just like a camera in the office in the suite 74 or 76. Yeah. That's what you want.
Yeah, but I feel like I can see what happened the day of the vote, because it was described so brilliantly by the people on the scene, especially this journalist I turned to over and over again, named his odd name of Murat Halstead. And he writes these incredibly detailed descriptions of what was going on, and you can really feel like you're there when you read these voices from the time.
Ken Burns says the reason he did those 2 massive documentaries, baseball and the Civil War, along with jazz music, is because 2 of those 2 things, baseball and the Civil War, are how we understand America. What do you believe Lincoln and baseball have in common? Why have those become, other than you, what do Lincoln and baseball have in common?
Well, they're just touchstones of the American experience. You look at any era of baseball and explore it, and it tells you so much about what America was like at that time culturally. The early baseball was like this. It was very vicious. It was bitterly competitive. They tried to twist the rules. They tried to get away with whatever they could. And that was like the culture of America in the late 19th century. And Lincoln is just, the Civil War itself is such a tremendous tragedy. And it's like it's really the crossroads of America. It's where we moved on from this terrible crime of slavery, and sort of through great agony and tragedy moved forward. And Lincoln was at the heart of that suffering. Now, if you put the 2 covers of my Lincoln books next to each other, you can see what the war took out of him. You can see how he
I'm looking
aged.
at them over your shoulder. The 2 pictures are extraordinary. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
He looks like a 50-year-old guy, and then he looks like a 75-year-old guy, right?
Yes, exactly. Yeah. That war tortured him and took everything out of him. And thank God he was the one there, because he was willing to endure that. And I think that's a really important thing for us to understand, how close we came to losing this country, and what the sacrifices made by people who came before us to create this country and preserve this country. And I think these ideals we have are still worth preserving.
Do you know what you're doing next?
I want to do 1/3 Lincoln book, and I want to do it in a microhistory fashion, just flashing a bright light on one part of his life that I think tells us a lot about him and about our nation's struggle to survive.
Have you decided the moment yet?
Yes, but I'm not.
You're not going to tell me? Fair enough. I love it. I don't want to embarrass you. I don't want to put you on the spot here, but I love asking authors about their dedications. You wrote To Valerie again.
Yes.
Who's Valerie and why did you write that?
Valerie's my wife, and she was with me during this writing of this book. After I finished each chapter, I would read it out loud to her. Lincoln often read things aloud because he liked to hear the sound of the words as well as it helped him help the sense sort of sink into his brain. So I like to do that. And I knew I was hitting the sweet spot when she said, I can't wait to hear what happens next, even though we all know what happens next. But she was so excited. When I came to the end of her chapter, she was like, I can't wait to hear what happens next. So that was very helpful to me writing this book.
Anybody who will sit there and listen to someone read their own book out loud to them definitely deserves to be in the dedication.
Yes, but she said it was fun. So that's, that was great.
Can't beat it. Ed Achorn, the author of The Lincoln Miracle, Inside the Republican Convention That Changed History. Thanks so much for being here.
Evan, it was great.
Check out the book. Check out his website, edachorn.com. He's on Twitter at @_Achorn. I want to invite listeners to our Patreon page to ask for your support in keeping the show going. Go to patreon.com/AxelBankHistory. We will donate part of your contributions to a charity for children's literacy. And thank you for listening to Axelbank Reports History and Today, conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter right now. Check us out on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Axelbank History. We update those with clips from the show, guest announcements, and book recommendations. We will see you next time. Thanks.